Violent video games have encouraged the killing of innocent people for sport.
The finger pointed at violence in video games and/or...
A coroner has expressed great concern over the violent video game Call of Duty after 4 teenagers who regularly played went to kill themselves.
Lanza spent hours a day honing his shooting skills by playing video games in his basement.
It's not what is it called? Art of War, Man of War? What do the kids play? Call of Duty. We don't allow that in our house.
Spending a few hours playing video games never hurt anyone, right? Well...
I can't explain it. The things you're saying to me, it's going yeah, 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 oh yeah. 'Cause I'm a 21st century digital boy. I don't know how to read, but I got a lot of toys. My daddy's a lazy middle class intellectual. My mommy's on Valium, so ineffectual.
Gender identification begins at an early age. Growing up as a boy, I remember accepting violence as a form of entertainment through my toy guns and the video games that I played, as well as a way to prove one's manhood. Video games become a portal to participate in violence. Whether games are rated E for everyone, T for teen, or M for mature, the majority of video games portray some form of violence. According to a study by Thompson and Haidinger in 2001, over 60% of rated E games have violence that is mandatory for players to advance themselves towards completing the game. Most video games exhibit violence, and most players are male, suggesting a connection between violence and masculine identification. Violence, as a form of identifying one's masculinity, is being introduced to boys in their youth through their environment. The social cost of promoting violence as a key component to masculinity can be devastating to the collective emotions of our communities. On April 20th, 1999, 2 high school students, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, massacred students at Columbine High School with guns and explosives. The actions of these 2 students created a moral panic, generated debates over gun culture in the United States, and attracted greater attention toward violent video games, as both were adamant fans of Doom and Wolfenstein 3D. According to U.S. psychiatrist Gerald Block, the killers' actions were likely caused by violent video games, as they were gratified by committing these acts of violence in the virtual worlds. By the time adolescents turn 17, the age limit for restrictions on all games are lifted, and video game players have full access to the most gory and popular games without any parental permission necessary. Today's most popular games amongst 17-year-old boys are violent, first-person shooter games such as Call of Duty. What do these boys learn from participating in games that desensitize them to violence, like Gears of War or Grand Theft Auto? They are being reconditioned to feel indifference to the real violence that exists in the world. This reduces video games and the violence contained within them to little more than virtual spaces that reinforce Western patriarchal ideologies.
Many game developers create their games with the intent of instilling a sense of domination into their male target demographic. A great amount of time and effort goes into modeling characters with incredible detail, as well as creating impressive virtual spaces. Yet all of this is wasted by making the primary method of interaction be through violence. The #1 best-selling games of the past 5 years have been violent, male-centric, and rated M. They pander to masculinity by creating power fantasies for the presumably male player to assert his dominance through the conquering of others. Developers are devoted to the idea that the player must always be in a position of power in order for the game to be fun. Games are rarely willing to incapacitate the player-controlled character through injuries or to kill him off permanently, despite the dangerous sequences they are put in. Thus, they forgo any realistic depictions of consequence in order to satiate the male power fantasy. Since developers are generally afraid to hinder the player's ability to enact violence, One of the ways they manifest the pretense of failure of the protagonist is through the kidnapping, abuse, or murder of women. It is a deceitful way to create motivation in the player by invoking the idea that their masculinity must be reclaimed by either rescuing or avenging the women through even more violence. This reinforces the pernicious gender roles of our society by portraying women as passive and also by using the role of the often male protagonist to impose traditional ideas of masculinity into the player. In an interview with The Guardian, the lead writer of 2013's best-selling game, Grand Theft Auto 4, responded to the lack of female protagonists in the game by saying, "The concept of being masculine was so key to the story." This sentiment is shared among the biggest publishers of the world, such as Ubisoft, who refused to feature a female protagonist in their latest game of the Assassin's Creed series because of the time and cost it would require to be developed. Progressive depictions are considered risks as tens of millions of dollars go into creating and marketing these big games. Despite women now making up 48% of the game-playing population, video game publishers would rather continue their questionable depictions of gender so that they can continue to profit off of the narrow focus on a male audience.
If video games continue to target a male demographic in terms of their design, characters, and marketing, what characteristics of masculinity are repeatedly being portrayed within them? In 1976, psychologist Robert Brennan identified 4 marks of traditional American masculinity. 1. No sissy stuff. Anything remotely feminine is strictly prohibited.
I didn't realize I was hanging out in the girls' dorm.
2. Be a big wheel. A man must possess wealth, fame, and power. 3. Be a sturdy oak. Men must show no emotion and admit no weakness. And 4. Give 'em hell. Men must be daring, aggressive, and willing to take risks. These rules are still very much present and highly exaggerated within the world of video games. The male protagonist must be daring, aggressive, and emotionally composed at all times. Alternative forms of masculinity are often used as sources of humor.
Ladies and gentlemen, I give you femboy.
While women are objectified to appeal to heterosexual male desires. According to Michael Kimmel, masculinity encourages men to use their sexual encounters as forms of social currency. This idea manifests itself quite literally within video games, as players are sometimes encouraged to collect women in the form of magazines or trading cards. Reducing women to collectibles or background decoration makes it easier for the player to justify violence against them, as they exist primarily to enhance the game's racing nature or to be used as a means of attaining an achievement. At the same time, however, male-on-female violence is also frequently used in order to instill shock value, when it is drastically reduced given the acceptance of this violence elsewhere. Even when the protagonist is female, like in Tomb Raider for example, the characters are often highly sexualized in order to satiate the male player.
If you look at someone like Lara Croft, but not only in the games obviously, Angelina Jolie in the films and various other manifestations, she's clearly a sexualized object. And when we objectify women, whether it's in games or television or on the internet, that leads to the objectifier not being able to understand that person as a person. So this is obviously a really negative, problematic thing. This is where we get the term sexism and misogyny really from, is thinking of women, and particularly women's bodies, as less than or only to be used for. The strange thing about Lara Croft is that over the years she has become sort of, I think you would say, less sexualized. Her bust is now smaller. In the latest game, she has a more athletic figure instead of, a tiny waist, tiny knees, sort of curvaceous thighs and buttocks, and really just a bust that doesn't make any sense. You can look at a lot of other games too in the way that females, even if they're the avatars, even if they're the active ones, they're still objectified, and that I think says more about the video game industry than it does about players, sadly. I think a lot of players would be just fine playing with a female avatar who wasn't sexualized. But there's an assumption, I think, in video game industry that is what sells and continues to sell, that and violence. And so they're sort of stuck in a Hollywood, cycle of upping the violence and upping the sexism and not working on things like story or depth of character, particularly female characters.
Violence against women is often used in game design to create false moral choices for the player. For example, in Red Dead Redemption, one mission leads the player to find a prostitute being beaten by her pimp. The player is given the option to buy her for $200 or let the violence continue. But even if the player chooses to buy her, she is later killed by her attacker regardless, making this a false moral choice, as it holds no consequence and simply occurs for shock value. Violence against women is also used as a way for game designers to make their world appear grittier and more supposedly realistic. This is problematic in that it objectifies female bodies and normalizes violence against them, such as in Far Cry 3, where you encounter female prostitutes being beaten by their pimps. These characters play no important role in the game's narrative, but are only there to be abused for the sake of cheap world building. While violence against women is a popular subject among mainstream video game journalists, the medium's reliance on violence in general is rarely called into question. More specifically, the glorification of militarized violence and its associations with masculine identity are topics that are frequently overlooked. But what is it about war games that make them so appealing?
Video games are a commodity that has evolved tremendously alongside technology. This evolution has brought about more opportunities to develop different genres of games. One of the most popular game genres remains the action-adventure shooter games. Many of the games in this particular genre are thematically militaristic. Some shooter games, such as Army of Two, are played in a third-person perspective. In these games, the player navigates the protagonist through space with an outside viewpoint. Then, there are first-person shooters in which the player assumes the perspective of an entrenched combatant. Games of this type, such as Battlefield or Call of Duty, draw special attention from the military because the people that play these carefully scripted games will presumably have some prior knowledge of battle if they choose to enlist after they come of age. Here in the United States, the act of war has become a spectacle to be consumed. In no areas is this more apparent than in Hollywood and the video game industry. The first-person shooter has become one of the most popular genres, with the Call of Duty franchise accounting for more than $10 billion in sales alone. Over 25 billion hours, or roughly 2.85 million years, have collectively been logged playing Call of Duty. The US military regularly hosts events for game developers in order to assist them in portraying the weapons and tactics of war as accurately as possible. In 2002, the Army even released its own free-to-play game, America's Army, in an attempt to bolster their declining recruitment numbers. The playable soldiers within these games are individualized as victims of war who are merely fighting to save their own lives. The real perpetrators of violence are the enemy combatants that are attempting to take their lives. These often orientalized depictions of enemy troops and their environments serve to dehumanize them in the eyes of the player. Even when developers strive for realism and authenticity, many sacrifices are made to ensure an entertaining combat experience. Civilians, for one, are almost always absent from gameplay, and although blood and gore are sometimes exaggerated, the true effects of violence in war are minimized or hidden. By centering player focus on the immediate context of survival rather than the overarching impact of the conflict, the game becomes a powerful instrument of propaganda, one that simplifies the act of war as an inevitable conflict between good and evil. Although there have not been any definitive studies that directly correlate the playing of militarized first-person shooter games to actual acts of violence, one must question the motivation behind the US military's interest in the development of these games if they in fact have little to no effect on their young target audience. Are these increasingly more realistic depictions of violence in video games an instance of art imitating life, or is there something more to it than that?
It certainly feels like we're in a more violent culture. Right? It feels like there are more school shootings, there are more police shootings of unarmed people. There are torture. You know, the torture that the military did in Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo. So yeah, it feels that way, but then you look at the statistics and we have to figure out whether that's the media telling us or making us feel as if it's more violent and that video games are to blame, or really look more closely and see what actually is going on. We're getting better at understanding the differences between violent content and violent behavior. The big question is, if you watch violent stuff, will it make you violent? And by and large, the way that we've studied it so far has shown that yes, there are some links, but if those links are absolutely causal or not, no, we haven't been able to show that. So kids do model their behavior if they see it, whether it's television, film, or a video game. One of the large worries when video games came along, let's say in the late 80s into the 90s, particularly during that first generation of graphics-driven games like GoldenEye or Tomb Raider, the first generation consoles that we are still using today. The big question was, okay, so these are interactive, whereas films and television aren't. So games are really going to be, they're going to be the ones that show us that there is a connection. So there's this social almost need or desire to show that there's a connection between the two, because most often we would like to scapegoat media. So going at video games as a cause of social and societal violence is difficult to prove. However, now we have things called MRIs. And we're finally getting to a point where we're looking at gamers' brains and how they're reacting while they're actually playing. For a long time, we couldn't use an MRI of a gamer that was actually playing because you had to stay so still. But now there are different kinds of MRIs, functional MRIs, and other scanning technologies that allow us to see what's going on in a player's brain. And it ends up that, yes, the areas that light up when you're playing a violent video game are the same that light up if you actually engage in physical activity or violence. So yeah, there is a correlation between how the brain is processing that game and how it processes violence or rigorous activity out in the world.
But there are other ways to imagine playing video games. There are many independent games that actively seek to question why large publishers continue to make the same types of violent and sexist games. These communities are becoming more vocal about providing a more diversified gaming experience that goes against the dominant ideologies that are portrayed in mainstream video games. Much of the content of independent games is actively engaging with and questioning the quote-unquote normative Hollywood-style game making. Video games do not have to rely on themes of violence and sexism in order to appeal to consumers. Games can successfully utilize non-violent and gender-inclusive mechanics in order to create new and engaging experiences. In Never Alone, a puzzle platform developed by Upper One Games, players are introduced to Alaskan indigenous folklore as they guide a young Inuit girl and her fox companion. While in Papo-Iyo, an adventure game by developer Minority, players must guide a monster while simultaneously navigating around the creature's violent tendencies. Games such as these alter the power dynamics between the player and the game's world, making players the primary recipients of the violence rather than the perpetrators of it. Representations of female characters within mainstream games have also started to improve, with less focus centered on their sexual appeal and more emphasis placed on portraying them as complex, independent characters. Video game developers have the ability to create diverse, immersive worlds that explore new perspectives and experiences. Why should these worlds continue to rely solely on male-centric forms of violence as their primary means of engagement?